Just want to say a word of welcome to everybody. We are in the midst of, if you can believe it, we're getting to the end, but we're still in the midst of a study of the Law of Moses, finishing up lesson number 9 on cleanness and uncleanness, and I suspect that we'll certainly get into lesson number 10 on vows. Might even get through that one and get on into the lesson on judicial laws. We'll just see how that goes. Maybe the place to start this morning would be Deuteronomy Chapter 23, if you'd like to read along in the passage. Deuteronomy 23, as we finish up this lesson on cleanness and uncleanness under the Law of Moses. Well, before we get started, I've asked Seth if he would to lead us in an opening prayer.
Let's pray. Our great and holy Father, we come to you thankful for this first day of the week that you have given us to come together to study from your word, to strengthen and encourage one another and to grow in our knowledge of what you desire for us. Father, we thank you for the examples that we have in the Old Testament, and we thank you for what we can learn from that. We ask you, Father, to please be with the teachers. Please help them to present their lessons in a clear and true manner, and please help us to listen attentively. Our God, there are those who are unable to be here due to their health issues. We ask you to please be with them. Help them to recover soon, if that be your will. Please be with those who are traveling. Keep them safe. Our Father, please continue to be with us through this time of study. Please help us to grow in our service to you. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
And thank you, Seth. And just a word, too, to our visitors. So glad to have you with us. And please, by all means, if you have any questions about anything we talk about this morning, just come grab me by the ear. Be glad to talk with you about any of it. Be glad to open up the Bible with you. We all would. Be glad to. All right, so let's see. Question number 14. We talked about a number of things. I won't go back and review. Let's just pick up with 14 and move on here. Deuteronomy 23, who suffered permanent exclusion from the assembly of the Lord? I see about 4 categories there. Yeah, those who are emasculated. So, and you think about the consequences of that. I don't know about you, but sometimes I don't remember this detail. Then you consider a man like Daniel, who was probably made a eunuch. Ebed-Melech in the time of about that same time, right? Time of Jeremiah. He would have been excluded from the assembly because he was a eunuch. So this would have been a source of great disappointment for a man. But then, I think, too, you get to the New Testament, and we have the Ethiopian eunuch, and what a door was now opened to him. There was no longer any stigma. There was no longer any distance. There was no longer any difference in that regard. When he became a Christian, he had the same access as any other man did. What are some other categories that we see there? Yeah, so somebody of illegitimate birth up to the 10th generation. I guess I should point out, too, when it says the assembly of the Lord, it doesn't mean that you can't live in Israel. But what it appears to be getting at is that somebody could not participate in public religious functions, ceremonies. So things like the Passover, taking of the Passover, or gathering for the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Tabernacles, that sort of thing. So somebody who's of illegitimate birth, 10 generations. And the Waldrons say, he's basically saying forever. It's kind of like 70 times 7, right? He's basically saying that it's never going to happen. What about Ammonites? How long were they? And Moabites, how long were they banned from the assembly? 10th generation again. But then we have the Edomites. They're only banned to the 3rd generation, right? So it's interesting. Of course, we're going to to see some of this. Recall that this is in Deuteronomy. We haven't actually covered the history of this point yet, but they will, as they make their way up, up into the area that the Ammonites held on the eastern side of the Jordan. They're going to ask the Edomites, hey, can we pass through your town? They're going to ask the Moabites, can we, or not town rather, but your land. The Moabites, can we pass through your land? And they're not going to let them. God says, hey, they're your relatives. Don't fight them for this. I've given them this land. But he does appear to hold it against them. In particular, the Ammonites and the Moabites, probably because of their parentage. All right. Under the law of Moses. Oh, by the way, so since we had a little distinction there between the assembly of the Lord, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you can't live in Israel. Doesn't mean that you have to live outside the camp. It just means you can't participate in public religious functions. We had a discussion last time about a woman after she gives birth, and we'll just take the case if she gives birth to a male, she's unclean as in her customary impurity for 7 days, and then another 33 days in. The term is the blood of her purification. And I went into this thinking that basically was a 40-day period of uncleanness, and we got to talking about that. And I think probably what we worked our way around to in the midst of that discussion is correct. That 7 days is when she is, in fact, unclean. If somebody touches her, if she sits on something like that, those things are unclean. That applies for that 7 days. But then that 33 days afterward is probably kind of like this question we were just talking about. She would not be allowed, say, to partake of the Passover or to participate in some sort of a public religious function until after that 40 days was complete. And by the way, when we get to the New Testament and we're reading Luke 2, how Jesus is born, and then they go and present him in the temple, and she offers her sacrifices at the end of that period. That would have been at the end of the 40 days. And so that's the reason that Mary was able to go into the temple area, was because she was cleansed of that impurity. Not that first week of uncleanness, but the whole 40-day period. Or maybe I should say specifically the 33-day period afterward. Anyway, just had a little bit of uncertainty about that in the last class, and just wanted to clear some of that up. All right. And so then finally, as we come to a close of this study, talking about cleanness and uncleanness, we look over to the book of Haggai, and what point does God bring out about the unclean? If anything unclean ever touches the clean, which way does the cleanness or uncleanness go? Does the clean always taint the unclean, or can the clean ever cleanse the unclean under the law of Moses? Unclean always taints the clean. So then, I think one of the things that's supposed to stick out to us, if we're familiar with our Old Testament, we're familiar with the way uncleanness worked and had to be worked. They had to work very hard to keep it contained, keep it in check. When we get to the New Testament, and Jesus touches a man with leprosy, touches a man with blindness, touches a woman who has a discharge, which way does the cleanness go there? Yeah, they become clean. So Stephen, I guess, made that. I don't think I'd ever really made the connection. Seen the contrast, and Stephen made that in a lesson a number of years ago, and it's stuck with me ever since. So, really, frankly, beautiful thing about what Jesus can do and how special He is. So let me make one closing observation here with regard to cleanness and uncleanness. So it's true. If a Hebrew living under the law of Moses has to come in contact with the dead, have a woman who gives birth, men go to war, there are certain things that are going to make you unclean. And it's just a matter of being alive. You're not going to be alive very long before something happens to you that makes you unclean. But I think even when we consider all of these different rules that they had to abide by, and all of the things that could make you unclean, it was not an inevitability every single day. And as we started the study, looking at the way the New Testament uses the word uncleanness, essentially associating it with sin, and of course that's the very picture God is painting here with all of these ordinances. I think we should also take a lesson from that. If a Hebrew was circumspect, if he was careful, he could, for the most part, avoid uncleanness. And then let me throw in some New Testament verses that I think we're supposed to take that lesson, look at how that if a Hebrew was careful, he could avoid uncleanness for the most part. Well, look at some of these New Testament verses. Ephesians 5, verses 15 and 16. We'll have one in Ephesians, one in 2 Corinthians, and one in 1 Corinthians. Now, people say, well, now that we're Christians, Jesus has lifted that burden from us, and some of us get so worked up about following all the rules, and we basically remade that prison for ourselves. Okay, I imagine that it is possible to be paralyzed with fear, so that to an unhealthy extent. Doubt that that's the problem for most of us. So Ephesians 5, 15 and 16, see that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Back in 2 Corinthians in chapter 13 and verse 5. Examine yourselves. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 5. Examine yourselves as to whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. And then finally, verse I know you're familiar with in 1 Corinthians 9. This is verse number 27. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 27, Paul writes, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." So when we look at those verses, especially all there together, does that paint the picture of somebody who's just happy-go-lucky? Sin's not really a big deal. I mean, Jesus has lifted that burden. Or does that paint the picture of somebody who, as the Hebrew, had to be careful about what he touched, what he came into contact with, what he ate, how he behaved? We need to have the same kind of careful attitude about the way we live. So then, before we move into talking about vows in Lesson 10, any comments or questions? Okay. A word first about vows. Now, I hear the word vow, and I think essentially an oath. In other words, in English, we use that essentially as a synonym for oath and vice versa. Under the law of Moses, it typically had a more narrow meaning. Now, it could be said that every vow is an oath, but not every oath is a vow. So in particular, the vows under the law of Moses that it regulated were commitments to donate something to the Lord: an animal, a house, a field, even a person, as we'll talk about here in a bit. Now, something that may not come across, pardon me, in the text is you read about redeeming a vow, and it looks as if you're not careful, it looks as if here somebody has vowed something, but if you want to give money to redeem that thing, there's a certain percentage that will be added. That is not, if somebody redeems the vow or the thing vowed, that is not that person failing to follow through on that vow. By redeeming the vow, he is in fact fulfilling it. So there's just a little detail that escaped me for a number of years. So yes, I can vow a sheep, let's say. But if I decide that I would like to redeem that, then I can pay some sum of money, given what that sheep is valued at. I can pay some sum of money plus a little bit extra, and that's just fine. I'm not breaking the vow. I am in fact fulfilling the vow by doing that. Alrighty, so then, general rule for keeping one's vow, particularly for men, according to these verses here in Numbers 30 and 23. How would you sum that up? And by the way, was a vow ever compulsory?
Well, if one made a vow, he was obligated to fulfill that vow.
Okay, yeah. If you made a vow, and of course this is one of those cases where the if is definitely significant. If you made a vow, you were in fact obligated to fulfill it. Yeah, vows were. In fact, it really is bound up even in the English word. The English word comes from a Latin word meaning to cast your vote, or basically to act of your will.
Distinction there as well, that they have to speak it, right? So if
That's true.
it's inside their heart, God knows the minds and hearts and intents of men, but if they actually speak it, then they have to.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure I had really given that much thought, but yeah, this would be something that you commit to verbally. Yeah, that's a good point.
Right,
think there's a sense of timeliness about it too.
Mhm.
It's not something you could postpone, and it would not have to be held.
All right, so let's look at that. Deuteronomy 23, verse 21. When you make a vow to the Lord, your God, you shall not delay to pay it. So this is not one of those things. I'm gonna give $1 million over the course of 30 years, something like that. I mean, that's fine if you work out an arrangement like that, but that did not seem to be the way these vows were. So that's a good point, Bryce. You shall not delay to pay it.
Another element to that of the act of the will is even in the covenants with God, those vows that the people made, he laid it out before them, but they made in other words, he didn't ratify the covenant one-sidedly.
Mm-hmm.
But he always, brings them into it, and they make proclamations, and they, even Joshua, it's choice.
Mm-hmm.
Choose you this day, right?
Mhm.
So it's not chosen for you, it is you choose. You decide, even to enter into those covenants with God. So even that's not compulsory. Obviously, the consequences are not good if you reject that covenant, but it's an offered covenant, not a, it's not put on you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so even the covenant of becoming his own special people was something he offered. He did not make them do that. I suppose they could have rejected it, or somebody could have said, I think I'm going to send this one out. But then they forfeit the blessings as well. A couple of notable places, I think, outside of the law of Moses that refer to oaths and vows that I think are worth bringing into this discussion. Proverbs 20, verse 25. It's a snare for a man to devote rashly something is holy, and afterward to reconsider his vows. That's Proverbs 20 and 25. A really good one, though, is Ecclesiastes 5, verses 1 through 7. And I wanted to read this because I think it gets a little bit at what Travis was getting at here just a moment ago. And note the talk of the fool here, or the picture of the fool here, and in particular how he is relating it to the idea of entering into a vow. So this is Ecclesiastes 5, verse 1. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven and you on earth. Therefore, let your words be few, for a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Verse 6, do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God. So I like that whole context. I mean, we're all, I think, pretty familiar with verse 5. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. But the whole context that we get around that verse is this picture. Somebody who's just saying, oh yeah, I'm not going to dedicate this to God, and hasn't really given that any thought. Whoa. You are a fool if you do that, is what the preacher says. Back off, take a minute, consider your words, don't enter into this. And so, unless you're serious about it. And so I think what you said about, hey, God says, okay, you don't have to enter into this. You can enter into this voluntarily, but realize the serious commitment that you're making when you make a vow like this. That was a very serious thing under the law of Moses. Now, there were some exceptions. Men, if you made a vow, you are bound to it. There's no changing it after that. But there were some exceptions. What about for a wife, if she had made a vow?
Well, the husband could annul it on the day that he hears of it.
Yeah.
Whether that happened before they got married or the day that she does it after they're married. But I mean, again, it had to do with timeliness, right? You couldn't later decide, well, I don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like the consequences of it, so we'll annul it now.
Mm-hmm.
Early on.
Yeah, the day, and I don't know so much. I think that it would probably apply if it was before they married. It would probably apply to her father. But I mean, there's clearly some give, if you will. When it says on the day that he hears of it.
with, a wife's vow would also obligate her husband indirectly, and I think there's something that goes along with that.
Yeah, I think you're right. So let's tell you what. Let's talk about these particular exceptions, and we'll come back to maybe the reasons why. Because somebody might look at that, especially in the 21st century. Well, what do you mean that a husband could just come in and say, no, you're not going to vow that? So the husband could overrule it if he heard it and said, no, I'm not. We're not going to do that. What about? I'm going to go in different order from the way the question is. How about the daughter living in her father's house? Who could overrule that? The father. But now what about a widow or a divorced woman? Yeah, she was obligated. Okay. So then I think Bryce really gets at the reason why. We don't like this so much in our culture, but if a woman in those days in particular is married, then it wasn't so much that it was her property, it was her husband's property. Her husband had authority over the household. And so if she is deciding to vow something or to dedicate something in a vow, she's, as Bryce said, obligating him, not just herself. They are not ultimately her possessions. And so he can come in and say, look, I really appreciate your enthusiasm, but that is vowing a little too much. I'm going to have to say you need to adjust your expectations, or we're just not going to be able to do that at all.
Yeah, it goes back to that whole voluntary aspect is
Mm-hmm.
that would be entering him into a vow that he did not make.
Right.
And so there must be agreement in that case.
Yeah. And in fact, I think that really is where we need to focus the attention. There needs to be agreement between husband and wife and that sort of thing, and not one or the other just going off half-cocked like that, and committing the household to something that the household cannot afford. Again, this is a voluntary thing. This is not something that God required, but if you entered into it, he did in fact require it of you. Then, of course, the widow or the divorced woman, she does own her own possessions. And so if she decides to vow something, then she is responsible for that.
If the man made a vow, he was obligated to keep it. Even
Absolutely.
if it did involve his wife or cost her something.
Or if he did not overrule her at the time that she made it, no, he is obligated to keep it.
What you were saying a minute ago, that they should have agreement. I'm just saying, he could make the vow, and she couldn't overrule it.
Correct.
So that might involve her, and him being the one in authority, and her being the helper, she might be on the hook for something.
Yeah. Yep. Agreed. Now, we've got a pretty famous example of this, and so I thought it was good to examine this question. Somebody makes a vow thoughtlessly. Later came to realize he simply could not fulfill it. Was there anything he could do about that? Mm-hmm.
And then make atonement for that with pretty much the standard, the lambs, the doves, the flour, those types of things.
Yeah, and this appears to be a trespass offering. It uses the term sin in one place, but then in Leviticus 5:7 it calls it a trespass. So this, we were talking as we were talking about the sin offering, and then following up talking about the trespass offering. Kind of difficult to see exactly when the trespass offering applies and when it's just, for lack of a better way of saying it, a plain old sin offering. Well, this appears to be one of the cases where it is a trespass offering, when you would have to follow those additional rules besides just the sin offering. Now, the prime example of this sort of thing is rash vow. Yeah, Jephthah. And I think Stephen made a mention of this when we talked about it briefly, talking about trespass offerings earlier. But here it's a little staggering. I even went back and reviewed Jephthah's case, and here you have a man. If you recall, the way Jephthah ended up, but even becoming a judge, it wasn't so much God's direct appointment of him, but rather the Ammonites were starting to threaten the Transjordanian tribes of Israel. And there just wasn't anybody who would step up. And so they go to Jephthah, whom they had cast out because, he was, was he illegitimate or was he the son of a harlot? I can't remember right this minute. I may be getting him confused with Abimelech. But anyway, they had cast him out, and he now says, well, okay, well, fine, I'll lead you. And then he goes to take the king of Ammon to task, because the king of Ammon says, hey, listen, you took that land for us. And he says, hang on, let's review a little history here. And he basically lays out how, no, we did not take that land from you. It was taken from you by the Amorites. We took it from the Amorites. And by the way, we've had it for 300 years, and you're just now thinking to mention this? You have no claim to this land. So here's a man who knows his history, and yet apparently doesn't know that there would have been some way. There was a sacrifice that he could offer to say, I have made a thoughtless vow, and it's something I simply cannot fulfill. I don't know if that was just pride. I don't know if it was ignorance. I don't know just what all was going on there. But it's for a number of years, I just thought, well, Jephthah was his daughter was out of luck, and defined in the law. Well, no, it's not that God is just saying, just like with our own sins, and when we beg forgiveness, it's not that he's saying, look, it's okay, you can sin, you just ask forgiveness. That's not the point. Rather, if you find that you have made a vow that you simply cannot, you might say, might even be immoral to fulfill, you can beg for God's mercy and offer a trespass offering. And Jephthah could have done the same thing. But I'm stepping on Marshall's toes here, so I won't go much further.
I would just say, don't ever look to the book of Judges for the approved example.
Right, yeah. In case you didn't hear that, the book of Judges doesn't contain too many approved examples, so be really careful about saying, well, Jephthah did it, so I think we're fine here. All right, the Nazarite vow. So this word Nazarite comes from a word in Hebrew meaning to separate. This is, if you want to turn to Numbers chapter 6, we'll be there for a few minutes. Interestingly, in a passage in Leviticus 25, talking about the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee, when they were not to reap their untended vines. That word untended is this same word, talking about to be separate or consecrated or untrimmed. Similarly, I think this is interesting. It's used of Joseph twice, almost verbatim. Once in Genesis 49, when Jacob is blessing Joseph and his progeny. The blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestor up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. And so that's this word that the Nazarite vow comes from. Moses basically quotes from that in Deuteronomy 33 when he's pronouncing a blessing upon the tribes of Joseph. With the precious things of this is 33 verse 16, with the precious things of the earth and its fullness and the favor of him who dwelt in the bush, let the blessing come on the head of Joseph and on the crown of him who was separate from his brothers. And Gesenius looks at that word and says it's not merely separate as in his brothers are here and he's over here, but it's almost the idea of a prince. His brothers are here and he's separated because he's been elevated. So that's the semantic range, if you will, of this word that is applied to this vow that we're about to talk about. So who then could take this Nazarite vow? Yep, any Israelite, man or woman, okay. And then what were the three things forbidden to a Nazarite while he was fulfilling, living out that vow? Nothing, yeah, that's well said. Nothing to do with the grape. As it says, from seed to skin. And then what's the third one? Yeah, don't come into contact with the corpse, okay. Now, as we've said, sometimes somebody, well, either you don't realize that you're about to make contact with a corpse, or someone falls dead in your presence. What happens if this fellow has made a Nazarite vow and that happens while he's within the period of that vow? What does he have to do? Yeah, shave his head on the seventh. He basically has to go through a cleansing process, right? Just as anybody who had to touch a dead body. But then, as you mentioned, on that seventh day, the final day of the cleansing, has to shave his head. Okay, all right. Yeah, male lamb as a talked about it earlier as a trespass offering. So here's another place where there's been, and again, this seems to be the idea of trespass. The Nazarite was limited to life in this box, if you will, and by stepping out, even by accident, by stepping out and making contact with a corpse, he was trespassing into a place he was not supposed to go, and so that's the reason he had to offer a trespass offering. Finally, those days were they were lost to him. If I'm interpreting this correctly, the fact that he has made the vow means that he has to fulfill it, and so now that those days have been lost to him, he just has to start over. Maybe it's the case that he could say, well, I tried, but I'm not going to be able to take this back up again because I only had this period of time that I could do this. But as I read it, he has made the vow, so that means that he just has to start over and fulfill it, even though that might not be convenient with regard to his schedule. So now, he makes the vow, he completes the days of his vow, and now what does he do to finally fulfill the vow? This is Numbers 3:13 through 20. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep, right. I didn't hear a burnt offering in there, or maybe I just missed it. But there was a burnt offering of a male lamb. The sin offering was a ewe lamb, and then the peace offering was a ram, and then of course the cakes that. Okay, gotcha. At any rate, so yeah, all that. This sounds pretty familiar, right? The kind of thing that they would do at feasts, or kind of thing that they would do when making, say, a set of offerings in order to cleanse uncleanness. Well, here is what this fellow does when he completes this vow. So this is not an insignificant vow. I mean, so not only is it the time and the things that you have to abstain from during the time of that vow, but these are not, these are not cheap offerings. This cost this fellow a lot. So I'd say that this is a significant thing that somebody decides to enter into this vow. Now we've got apparently 3 lifelong Nazarites, and I guess a word about this. You hear about these 3 fellows, and you think, well, the Nazarites, I guess they were all lifelong. No, for most people who made this vow, the great majority of people who made this vow, it was a limited time. Days, weeks, maybe months, I suppose, but it was not lifelong. These 3 examples that we have in the Scriptures are definitely exceptions. So who are the 3 lifelong Nazarites that we have in the Scriptures? Samson, yeah. Samuel. I kind of forget Samuel. So Samson, Samuel, then one more? Yeah, John the Baptist, right, exactly. And again, notice that it appears that they were not forbidden to touch a corpse. The main thing with them seems to be don't cut your hair and don't have anything to do with the grape. Of course, how could you possibly go through life without ever touching and never touch a dead body? That seems to be the concession there. Let's see. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's 2 Corinthians trying to do too many things at once. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 17. Yeah. And of course, that comes from, let me see, I believe that comes from Numbers 33. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will be with you. So, yeah, a nice New Testament parallel, which, of course, is just quoting directly from the Old Testament, but a nice New Testament parallel to this idea of the Nazarite who sets himself apart. Just let me run through this right quick. We have these valuations. So I said that you could redeem an animal, or rather you could vow an animal or a house or a field, even a person. But of course, the practice would be to redeem the person. I suppose in every case, maybe somebody like Samuel is an exception to that. But in most cases, you would, if not all cases, you would redeem the person. And these are the valuations that are given to those people. Now, I altered the way I asked the question because I went back and was rereading it, and I think the idea is, even though the text says from 20 years old all the way up to 60, when you get down to the 60, it seems to say 60 years old and older. So, if you will, the end of the range, the age range, is not inclusive, to borrow some mathematic terms. So if you're a male 20 to 59, if somebody's going to redeem you, or you were considered valued at 50 shekels of silver. Now, if I understand it correctly, that would not be the redemption value. The redemption value would be another 20% on top of that. And so each of these numbers would be add 20% in order to redeem this person if you have vowed this person. All right. It's there in the text, and here's a quick table for reference there. Now, somebody could be too poor to pay the vow, and what was it? So, if they could not meet these numbers, what was that person allowed to do in order to be able to pay something for the vow? This is Leviticus 27, verse 8. Yeah, based on whatever he could afford. So, it's interesting to me just how many concessions that God makes for people, I think, who are trying to demonstrate devotion, and yet for whatever reason cannot ultimately fulfill that. There does seem to be a difference, I guess is what I'm getting at. There seems to be a difference between someone who says, devote a lamb, and didn't really give that thought, versus somebody who genuinely wanted to do this, maybe was able to do it in the beginning, but something happened between the time he made the vow and he paid the vow such that he could not follow through with it. Let's see. I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock here. Oh, I really did think that we might get through all of these. So the question here, number 6, did the Lord allow an offerer to redeem an animal that was clean and an acceptable offering? So a fellow says, well, I'd like to devote this lamb in vow to the Lord. And then he thinks, actually, I'd rather devote this lamb. What happens in that case? If he devoted lamb A and said, well, no, actually, I want to devote lamb B instead. Yeah, they both. So this is, hey, don't go changing your mind. You made a vow, fulfill it. It's going to cost you even more if you somehow try to waffle on that. Let's see. Who determined the valuation for an unclean animal? Again, the priest would come into the picture there. And then what I think we'll find that this is the case in pretty much every vow. When somebody wants to vow a certain unclean animal, well, that's fine, appreciate your devotion, but that's an unclean animal. It cannot be given as a vow. You must redeem it. Kind of like the firstborn of a donkey. You can't take and devote the firstborn of a donkey to the Lord. You must break its neck, or you must redeem it. Same sort of thing here with these unclean animals, but you have to, whatever the priest says it's worth, okay, that's worth 5 shekels. You need to add 20% to it. All right, we will pick up in question number 7. Definitely get into judicial laws next time, and I'd say you might even work a few questions into that last lesson number 12. And just want to say I appreciate your attention and your comments.